Today on Inside Utah Politics, the 2022 midterm election. Challengers are lining up to face incumbents in Utah. Why? And can they be successful? Jason Perry with the Hinckley Institute of Politics is here with analysis. And what to do about a troubling trend of bad behavior aboard flights. A House committee hearing testimony from those on the front lines.
Time now for Inside Utah Politics.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Glenn Mills. It is time to go inside Utah politics, and we do begin this morning with Jason Perry. He's the director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Jason, as always, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
So glad to be with you, Glenn.
Let's dig into these midterms. Some interesting developments happening, and it seems to be earlier and earlier every cycle. But challengers stepping up to face incumbents here in the state of Utah. Why do you suppose that is?
Well, I mean, there are a bunch of reasons why someone decides to jump in the race. I'll start with the most altruistic, because they feel like they can make a difference. Not really happy with what's happening with who is representing me. I think I might be able to mount a successful challenge. So there's the sort of like, I just feel like I can do something great. The second one is connected to that is, every once in a while you get these elected officials and, people are starting to take little chunks out of them, the press, and the articles. People say, well, they might just be weak enough for me to get there. So that's a part of it. And I guess the third reason really is some of these elected officials are in spots where they just don't come open very often. So people are looking at the clock and they say, well, it might be just my time, all right? They may be a little weak. I feel like I can do something. And really, it's time for me to make an opportunity for myself right now, because you never know when it will come around again.
Yeah. Let's take a look at the Senate race. Senator Mike Lee going for re-election. Yeah. Becky Edwards, former state representative, and Ali Isom, a former staffer of Governor Herbert, both jumping into that race for the Republican nomination. You've done some polling. Yeah. Talk about what you're seeing from the numbers.
Well, it's really hard to take down an incumbent under most circumstances, and that certainly seems to be the case here with Senator Mike Lee. So we have been doing polling to see how people feel about that race in the state of Utah. And it's interesting because we want to say, well, who's going to show up? And, will Republicans show up to vote in this next election cycle? And turns out most of them are. Something just like 62% of people in Utah said if they are Republicans, they will show up to vote. Another huge chunk of people say, I'm going to register as a Republican to show up and vote. And so we really have some kind of sense who's going to show up. And of those, about 54% of those Republicans say they're going to vote, and they're going to vote for Mike Lee. So that's what's interesting. He just really has a really strong base with the more conservative elements of the Republican Party. And right now, those are the people who are probably going to show up. And right now, we know who they're going to vote for.
How many were undecided in that poll?
Yeah, so there's a lot. It was about 33% when we do a head-to-head with Senator Lee and Ali Isom and Becky Edwards. Becky was polling somewhere around 11%. Ali Isom was somewhere around 3%. And the big number right there for us all to watch over the next couple of months is that 33% of Utahns are looking at this race saying, I haven't completely decided. That is the group of voters that Ali and Becky particularly are going to be trying to get to.
Okay, let's dig into that a little bit more, because I've talked to a lot of people who look at this race and say, if both of them get on the primary ballot, that this would likely be an easy win for Senator Lee. However, if they come together and decide that just one of them should move forward, could that have an impact on the race?
That could be a really good and interesting strategy, because what you're saying is right. As you say, I have these two more moderate Republicans here on the ballot. I mean, the truth is that they're mostly eating each other's votes. People are coming in and they're the ones that are swapping. So if one of them really wants to try to take a dent out of that lead that Senator Mike Lee has at this point, they're going to need to strategize in some way. Keep in mind, Glenn, both of them got signatures. Both of them are going to be on that ballot, at least right now is what they're saying. So we'll see if there's some sort of negotiation that happen behind the scenes right there, because the reality is they're just going to really impact each other, not to mention the fact that there is an independent candidate who has filed that will also take some of those votes.
Yeah, we'll get into that for sure, but let's get into one other point here. If it's just one of them on the ballot, do the numbers right now indicate that Senator Lee is still going to win that race?
Right now it does look like that. That is just the case. And it's because he really has shored up his base, the people that are going to show up and vote. It's right now. You never say never in politics,
sure,
but he has to feel really good about where he is with the people who are going to show up, and that's the more conservative element of the Republican Party. Those people are going to show up, and it makes it really hard to beat him at this point, even if you just consolidate the numbers down to 2.
Okay, let's get into more of what you already brought up at this point. Evan McMullen, he's running as an independent. Obviously, we're not talking primary here, but in the general election, you tend to see Senator Lee's numbers come down a little bit when we're talking about the overall electorate in the state of Utah. So how could that potentially play out?
Well, it's going to be so interesting to watch. You and I follow politics so closely, and I'll just tell you, you're looking at history of independent candidates in the state of Utah, they typically get, well, less than 5% of the vote. You have a few outliers. I mean, Evan McMullen being one of those. And in the presidential election, he got 21% of the vote in Utah. If you go back a little farther for the people who follow politics closely, Merrill Cook got 21% at one point. Ross Perot was 26% in the state of Utah. It's possible for a third-party candidate to, be sort of one of those outliers. It doesn't happen very often, and it's going to be very interesting to see if Evan McMullen is going to be able to make a name for himself enough for people to want to come and vote for him.
Yeah, I'm not aware of an independent candidate in Utah winning a statewide race. So how much of an uphill battle is that?
It's an enormous battle. Right now, for one of these statewide races, it's hard anyway. Senator Mike Lee has a pretty good level of support, and Evan McMullen really has to make a name for himself. When he got 21% of the vote in Utah, some people knew who he was. Mostly they knew who he wasn't, which wasn't Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, and so he got a lot of support right there. But he's going to have to make his own name and really give people a reason to vote for him, not to vote against someone else.
What might Democrats do in this situation? Do you expect them to still nominate a candidate to be on the ballot as well, or might Democrats look at this and say, hey, let's get behind the independent?
Well, that's going to be so interesting. We saw one high-profile Democrat in Ben McAdams, a former member of Congress. He did support Evan McMullen recently, which is so interesting to see if that might be a trend that happens with the other Democrats in the state of Utah. We really will see. The Democrats are not going to leave it unchallenged. They usually find a candidate, a credible candidate to fill in that role. We'll see what they decide to do. But it's going to be interesting to see if Evan McMullen really tries to pull some Democrats to his side, and that's really his strategy.
Yeah, we will wait and see. Let's talk national outlook. We saw a poll from ABC come out just this week showing that President Biden's approval rating down to 41%, the lowest it's been. Are Republicans poised for big wins in 2022?
Well, right now it sure looks like that's a possibility. The Republicans are they're looking at what happened like in Virginia, for example, to see what sort of messages really resonated with Republicans around the country. Certainly there in Virginia. Were they able to get to those suburbs? Were they able to get people to vote on certain issues? Republicans are mounting a strategy based on what they saw there, the messaging that worked. And these are really take-home messages that Republicans are going to try to get. There's things like education, for example, making sure parents are involved in that education, the economy, some of those things which Glenn have been historically some of those things that the Democrats have owned. The Republicans are trying to really make a case for those things. And when it comes to that education component, particularly what's happened around the country this past year, that's going to be a major issue in this next election.
So what do you expect to see from Democrats over the next little bit as we head to those vital elections, midterm elections?
The Democrats are going to have to try to reclaim what's happening right now, reclaim the message. And it's going to have to be a reframing, I think. Democrats, for a long time, were owning that message of education. So to the extent that they can be successful, it's reclaiming kind of those street-level political issues that have been so good for Democrats for so long, and mostly also saying, we know the president is not doing very well in terms of his popularity, but we are independent. Those are not the coattails that we have to be riding. We're making a very local case. And I think that's what we're going to see around the country is a little less trying to get the Joe Biden coattails, if there are any at the time, and really just retail politics in a very local kind of way.
Yeah, and if you take a look at history, it typically goes that whoever's in the White House doesn't do so well in the next midterm election.
The pendulum swings. You and I watch this all the time. Yeah. It just swings. That's what happens.
Yep, no doubt about that. And numbers are... The margin right now isn't that big anyway, especially in the Senate when you look at that. All right, Jason, always appreciate your analysis. Thanks so much for being here. Appreciate your time.
Glad to be with you.
Still to come, congressional and legislative boundaries are set for the next 10 years in Utah. House leaders from both sides are here to weigh in on the redistricting process a little later. But first, Republican lawmakers and advocates organizing a nationwide rally taking aim at school curriculum. What they're calling for after the break. Ahead of the holiday travel season, airline workers say they're concerned about potential threats over new safety protocols. At a hearing, labor union leaders urging Congress and the Justice Department to do more to protect workers from a surge in violent attacks. Washington correspondent Raquel Martin reports.
Flight attendants are begging, make it stop.
Following a surge in airline assaults throughout the pandemic, airline workers are pleading with Congress for help.
More needs to be done to discourage this kind of horrific behavior.
At a Tuesday hearing, labor union leaders representing flight attendants, ground workers, and TSA agents demanded more security training and increased criminal prosecutions against attackers.
Of the more than 5,000 assaults reported to the FAA, only 37 were recommended for criminal prosecution.
The FAA says more than 70% of incidents involving airline staff are over masks. Democratic Congresswoman Bonnie Coleman agrees more aggressive action is necessary.
Violators must be held accountable without exception.
And with the busy holiday travel season approaching, some union leaders say they're concerned vaccine mandates could make it more difficult to keep airports safe and staffed.
TSA must staff adequately.
Dr. Everett Kelly, the president of AFL-CIO, says right now only about 60% of TSA staff are fully vaccinated. He wants the federal vaccine mandate delayed.
And until January the 4th, will provide consistency.
Republican Congressman Carlos Jimenez calls the entire mandate wrong.
TSA employees should have the right to choose if and when they will receive the vaccine.
So far, the White House has not announced any plans to extend the deadline. In Washington, Raquel Martin.
A group of concerned parents rallying outside the U.S. Capitol over concerns they are being pushed out of the classroom. Washington correspondent Rashad Hudson has more.
Parents are being pushed out.
Carrie Lucas and other concerned parents rallied outside of the Capitol Tuesday, calling on the government to stay out of parenting.
And there's a sense that government wants to take over more and more of what used to be considered private life.
Parents' rights activists like Jenny Gentle say they oppose critical race theory and explicit books in school curriculum.
Cultural issues that probably should not be taught in the classroom.
In response to those concerns, conservative lawmakers are proposing a Parents' Bill of Rights to give them more of a voice in their children's education.
And politicians should never come anywhere near the classrooms.
Republicans like Indiana Congressman Jim Banks are also pushing legislation for parents to have access to their child's curriculum.
Parents have a right to know what their kids are taught.
But Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown says parents already have a say in education.
That's why we have school board elections with those decisions made locally by whom you elect on going to a school board member and saying, please change this policy.
Brown says Republicans want a federal takeover of the classroom.
Same radicals that think the election was stolen are trying to do a federal takeover of local school districts, and it's radical and it's stupid.
The parents' groups say they plan to take their message into the 2022 midterm elections. Reporting in Washington, Rashad Hudson.
Coming up, the controversial redistricting process is complete and the maps are set. House members from both sides weigh in after the break. Time now to dig deeper into the redistricting process in our state with the Inside Utah Politics panel. This week we have State Representative Paul Ray and House Minority Leader Brian King. Gentlemen, thanks so much for being here. Appreciate having you on the show.
Thank you.
Huge topic. The maps are now set for the next 10 years here in the state of Utah. Representative Ray, you were co-chair of the Legislative Redistricting Committee. I'd like to get your assessment of the map, and let's start with congressional map here in the state of Utah. Your thoughts of the final product.
Well, we put a lot of time and effort in that congressional map, and one of the key principles going into is we wanted to make sure that we had an equal representation between rural and urban Utah. And so I think we accomplished that and keeping our deviations down to zero. So, we put together, I think, a pretty strong map. Obviously, there's people that don't like it, but there's still a lot of people that like it also. And on the Princeton gerrymandering scale, that actually was graded an A before they pulled the grades off on some of the other ones, but we did get an A on that.
Representative King, you voted against it. Why?
I voted against it for the same reason I think that all the Democrats voted against it, which is it just didn't feel like it was part of the same process that we went through with the other 3 maps that we drew. I know the Democrats on the redistricting committee felt like they had a good collaborative working relationship with the Republicans, but when it came to the congressional map, and the same thing happened to us in 2011 when I was on the redistricting committee, the Republicans just said, thanks, we don't need your help, we'll take care of this ourselves. My suspicion is that the product that we ended up passing in the legislature was something that was formed more outside the state of Utah by Republican or conservative groups and then parachuted into Utah. I don't think it was a good process for that congressional map, and I don't think the final product was a reflection of what Utahns wanted.
Representative Ray addressed that. Outside interests, is that what happened here?
Not true at all. Myself, Senator Sandel, we sat and drew those maps. We had groups that wanted to get involved, and we actually kept a lot of groups out and kept it local. So there was nothing parachuted in from any other state. This is what we did, and what we took it out to the whole body.
One of the more controversial points was what happened in Salt Lake County. I want to get your both of your thoughts on that. You take a look at Salt Lake County, and a lot of people thought, yeah, maybe it'll be split 2 ways, maybe even 3, but a lot of people didn't see 4 ways coming. Representative King, let's start with you on that one.
Yeah, it's a real problem. I mean, you have to split Salt Lake County. Let's be clear, you got to split it at least 1 way. I mean, you have to have 2 districts in Salt Lake County. It's too big population-wise to not split. So we're reconciled to that idea. Well, our current situation for the last 10 years, we've had it split 3 ways. There's no good reason to split it 4 ways at all, other than to maximize the likelihood that those 4 congressional districts are held by Republicans and to minimize the likelihood that a Democrat can win. It's not good for communities of interest. It's not a reflection of the will of the people of the state of Utah that they want to have Utah's largest county split 4 ways. And it was one of the primary reasons that you had Democrats and some Republicans voting against that congressional map.
Real quick before we move on to Representative Ray, we've heard a lot about communities of interest. Representative King, dig into that a little more. What is it, and how do you feel they were not best served in this process?
Communities of interest, and keeping communities of interest together to the greatest extent possible is one of a number of core principles of good redistricting. And we tried to do that at the legislature. And I felt like the maps involving the State House, the State Senate, and the school board reflected that to a much greater degree than the congressional map. You're going to have to split some communities of interest in any redistricting process, that's true. But to do it so directly and flagrantly, so explicitly when you're talking about splitting Salt Lake County 4 ways, that county should be kept to no more of a split than to have 2 congressional districts that it has to deal with in order to reflect the wishes of the individuals who live in Salt Lake County.
Representative Ray addressed 2 things here. Why was Salt Lake County split into 4 districts, and the community of interest issue?
Well, my first thing is define community of interest. There's no definition to that. So there are thousands, tens of thousands of communities of interest that you could look at. So, you know, what we looked at was geographical, city, county, those types of things. And then Salt Lake County is the population base for the state of Utah. So this is where the majority of the population was, and where a good percentage of the population growth was that southwest corner of Salt Lake County. So when we divided, we wanted to make sure we kept the urban and the rural mixed together, and you can't do that without divisions in Salt Lake County. And so we thought if you really want to look at communities of interest, you need to talk rural communities of interest also, and how to keep those. So the dividing line ended up being 3900 South, which was honestly just based on population and where people were and how we had to divide those 4 to get an equal representation for rural and urban Utah.
Representative King, picking up this communities of interest issue again, as Representative Ray just asked, define it. How do you define it?
Well, it's defined by cities and towns, it's defined by counties. As I said earlier, you're always going to have splits in communities of interest. What you're trying to do is minimize them to the greatest extent possible. And there's no question that Utah is a relatively urban or at least suburban area compared to its rural population. There are plenty of states, many states, in fact most states in this country, that have a greater percentage of their population rural than Utah does. So the idea that you have to have 4 districts that mix rural and urban, that's not true at all. And it's not a reflection of the reality of how people in Utah live. So my only point is, there's a better way of preserving communities of interest such as Salt Lake County than to split it so flagrantly into 4 almost equally divided pieces.
Representative Ray, Representative King brought up something earlier I want to get your thoughts on, and that being that these districts are drawn to maintain Republican control. Is that what happened?
These districts were drawn based on population. You know, if we want the urban and rural mix and you want to make it even, that's how we divided them up. You know, they end up, I mean, Utah's a Republican state, so it's hard to say we're going to create a Democrat district and not gerrymander to a Democrat district. And if you look at the IRC maps, that's kind of what you saw. It's what's called packing. You know, they took all the Democrats and packed them into one district and then made it 3 extremely strong Republican districts. And what we did is say, wait, we're just going to divide it by 4 and put it out there, and that's what we did.
Representative King, Democrats have had success in the 4th congressional district. Do you believe the way it was drawn this time will eliminate that?
I think it certainly reduces that. In the same way that Representative Ray talks about packing members of one party into one district, you can crack individuals in a way that results in a greater likelihood for a minority population politically being unable to control any seat because you crack them up, you spread them up equally in equal minority proportions among the number of districts that you're talking about. So packing and cracking are very well understood and known in the redistricting process. You can use either one if you want to achieve political ends. In this particular congressional map, we saw cracking used to ensure that there's a greater likelihood that Republicans will have 4 safe seats in Utah.
Address something Representative Ray said there, though, because when you take a look at the numbers, Democrats are small in number when it comes to the Republican Party and unaffiliated voters in the state of Utah. So how do you then make a competitive Democratic district without doing what we're talking about, gerrymandering?
It's not difficult. I mean, what we had is a competitive Democratic district with CD4 right now, and you saw Ben McAdams, Representative McAdams, hold that seat. You saw, of course, Jim Matheson hold it for a number of years before that. Then Mia Love came in and held it for a term or 2. So that was a competitive seat, relatively speaking. What you've got right now are 4 new seats, none of which are as competitive as CD4 currently is and has been for the last 10 years.
Representative Ray, talk about the process. You were involved with it as the co-chair of the committee. What worked, what didn't, and what would you like to see moving forward?
Well, first of all, CD4 had 65,000 people too many, so it had to move, it had to change. So that's what we did. And you know, I think looking at it overall, I think we really bipartisan on most of these maps. We worked really well across the aisle, made sure that everybody was involved. Congressional maps, those were actually the last maps we drew. It was a lot harder to draw 75 House districts. You know, and then we came in and finished up with congressional districts. And so, you know, I think moving forward, I think the hard part is we need to go back at some point and evaluate, you know, do we need the redistricting commission or not? You know, was it money well spent? I think that's something over the next few years that we can look back on and say, is this something to continue moving forward? Is there changes that we need to make, or do we just not do it going forward?
Representative King, your thoughts on that? $1 million for that commission, and in the end, their work was not adopted.
That's right.
Moving forward, what should the role of that commission be?
I think you've got to keep that commission in place, and here's why. Utah voters spoke in 2018. There was a lot of time and effort put into initiative for Proposition 4, the Better Boundaries Initiative, and people came out in numbers that were great, and they voted for it. It wasn't by a huge margin, but it was a yes vote on Proposition 4, Better Boundaries. We need to honor the will of Utahns. They've spoken. That was a campaign that was funded well, and there was a great debate on both sides of the issue. Utahns came out in 2018 in record numbers and voted yes.
Okay, I'm running out of time, so I just want to give Representative Ray about 10 seconds to respond to that point. It was the will of the people in 2018.
It passed in 4 counties. It barely passed by a few thousand votes. And I think had you not had marijuana and other things on the ballot, that would have failed miserably. And I know as I talked to people in my district, there really was not a lot of interest in the commission. And constitutionally, it's the legislature's job to do that.
Okay.
I'm not sure why we're spending $1 million to have somebody else come in and advise us.
We're going to have to end it on that note, gentlemen. Great conversation. It did pass, you're right, by about 7,000 votes, a very close one. Thanks so much for being here. Appreciate your analysis today.
Thank you.
Stay with us. We'll be right back with more Inside Utah Politics right after the break. We leave now with a look at what's on the radar in the world of politics. Speaker Brad Wilson hosting a summit on the Great Salt Lake. It's Wednesday, January 5th at the Eccles Wildlife Education Center in Farmington. The public will be able to participate virtually. The legislative session starts a few weeks after that, Tuesday, January 18th. Make sure to connect with me on social media. I'd like to know what you think of this show and other issues that are important to you. Thanks so much for making us part of your Sunday morning. We hope to see you again next week as we go inside Utah politics.